All right, I am excited to introduce to you guys Jillian Gaeta. She has been here several times now, so we always enjoy having her. She has worked in New York City public schools for over a decade, started in the South Bronx and moved to her native Brooklyn. She has taught grades 5 through 12 with both American and global history. But I love this. She says her greatest career achievement is getting 80 tickets for her kids to go see Hamilton. I want to be in your class. I really think I do. She's worked with graduate students who are learning to become social studies teachers, and she serves as the Associate Director of History for Achievement First for middle school, supports history teachers across her network. She is also one of the founders of Roots to Revolution, where she's, I'm going to drop the website as soon as I stop talking here. This is the organization that she runs to help adults feel more empowered to engage in their community by learning about history, by learning about the things that she's going to be presenting tonight. So really excited to have her back.
Hello, everyone. I'm so thrilled that you are all here tonight and that we're here to talk about how our government works, or how our government should work. Sometimes it feels like these days it's not working the way it should be working, but really excited to be here. And so I just want to talk a little bit about Roots to Revolution and what we do. So Roots to Revolution was started by myself and 2 other educators in the summer of 2020, and we started to help people understand the history of racism in America, Black history, and we've expanded now to talk a lot about LGBTQ history, feminism, civics, but there's so much of our history that has not been learned. And he's either deliberately left out of school, or maybe we had excellent teachers and we just forgot about it because we were 16 and the last time we took a history class and we didn't go to college and study history was when we were, in high school. And so we need to refresh ourselves. And so I really believe in helping adults learn this history, learn about the truth about America, and really, use that then to be activists in their community. And so partnering with Red, White, and Blue just always made so much sense because our missions are so aligned. So I just want to say a few things. Just if you can turn on your camera, that'd be great. Because if you have questions, and we're going to have some share outs, would love for you to share and ask questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat so I can answer them. Would love to hear them and just get comfortable. All right, so I want to just start off with some words of inspiration, and I'm going to start with Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American woman elected to Congress, and she was the first African-American woman to run on a major political party ticket, and this is her campaign poster from 1972 when she ran for office. And I love these 2 quotes by Shirley. If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair, and service is the rent we pay for the privilege of living on this earth. And I think that Shirley Chisholm embodied what it means to be politically active, to defy expectations, to fight for justice. And I also love Shirley because she started out as a teacher in Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I used to work at the school that was directly across from the high school where she taught, so very close to schools I've worked in. And I like to share that with people because she did not start as a politician, and I like to share in these sessions, and all of you are civically engaged, is that you should consider running for office and think about how you can do that work, and also maybe support teachers in running for office, getting that work out of there. But I want to use Shirley's vision, her mantra, her energy, her power to help us tonight when we think about some of this history in this session. So I have some few big goals for tonight's session, and I know Julie is doing a lot of other work with civic engagement as well, so we're not going to go over everything, but I did want to lay out a few of the key principles in the Constitution, go over some of the ways in which the checks and balances system plays out in our government, talk a little bit about the concept of federalism, and then also leave you with some direct action throughout the session of things that you can be doing to be politically engaged and think about how to keep your representatives accountable. Okay, the state of civics education. So this is this was Fordham Institute did a report in 2021 on the state of history education in America and the state of civics education. Now, keep in mind, this study was done prior to any of the censorship that we're seeing across the country around history education and book bans. And what they found were these were the only states, according to their ratings, that had high grades in civics and US history education. And some of these states might surprise you that are on this list, right? Because they're not necessarily all blue states that ranked highly for civics education or US history education. There's a mix of blue and red states there. So I think it's interesting when outside evaluators look at what is happening, what we see. But I think the hard part about this is that there were 32 states that received a inadequate rating in terms of civics education and US history education. And that is a deliberate choice by politicians, because it is proven that when the more people vote, right, the more work politicians have to do because they're held accountable. And the more people vote, usually they vote for liberal politicians. And so there are a lot of Republicans who have an invested interest in making sure that civics education and US history education is not taught and not taught well. And so if you're here and feeling like a lot of the things you're hearing tonight, maybe you didn't learn or you don't remember, that in some ways is by design. I think about a friend who tells me that the only time she learned civics was, end quote, was in 12th grade. And what her teacher used to do was play The Simpsons. And I'm not here to bash teachers because I love teachers. I am a teacher, but there are some teachers who are not great, right? And if you had that experience with a teacher who wasn't great, you may not have learned some really important parts about how to get involved in your government. And so I say that because I don't want anyone to enter into tonight's conversation from a place of shame. I want people to really understand that you can, learn more, and there's always time to learn, and there's nothing to be embarrassed about if there's information that you don't know. And I'm just really so grateful that everyone is here. So the first thing that I would love for people to do when they leave tonight, and I'm gonna pause this for a second and pull up the website for you, but I want you to think about, I'm going to send you this link, right, of the Fordham Education Study, and I'll have Julie email it out to all of you. And I want you to see where your state is in terms of civic education. And this is perfect that you're aligned, school board meetings are happening. And I want you to go to your school board meeting, and I want you to ask how you can support teachers with civics education. If your state is an exemplary state, I want you to find out in your school district which teachers are doing this well. So if you have children, right, asking your kids what they're learning in school, which are their favorite history teachers, right? And how can you amplify and support the work that those teachers are doing? Maybe it's going on Donors Choose, which is a teacher website, and getting more supplies for their classroom. Maybe it's just connecting them with other teachers in neighboring communities and helping them share lesson plans or resources, right? But I think it's important that we not only hold elected officials accountable who are not doing the right thing, but also celebrate the elected officials and the teachers and the people that are doing things well and helping us get to where we need to be in this country. So I'm going to drop this into the chat so you can see where the study came from. It's a 200-page study, so I'm not asking for all of you to read that right now, but you can skim through it and you can have that resource. But I also, I saw someone in the chat said, I'm surprised Alabama is on this list, right? So sometimes we need to look at like educator resources, right? Not only the polarizing places in education to really find out the truth about what is going on. So I liked this study because it was an independent organization and it was not necessarily correlated to partisan politics. Okay, so we're going to dive into a few key facts about the Constitution and talk a little bit about how the different branches of government works, and here's some important things to know. So the Constitution starts with the preamble, and I think probably many of you have heard that. There are 7 articles in the Constitution. So I remember one time my aunt was reading the Constitution over to her children, and she said to me, I didn't realize it was so short. And it's really not a super long document, right? There's so much depth to how we interpret it, but reading the primary source is really not as long as many people think. There are 27 amendments in the Constitution. First 10 are known as the Bill of Rights. I thought this was a funny fact. The last time the Constitution was amended was in 1992, limiting pay raises to Congress. And what I thought was funny about that was limiting pay raises of Congress was the longest amendment to be ratified, which made sense to me. They don't want their own salaries to not be to be able to be changed. And then the Constitution is what outlines the role of each branch of government. And so really important to understand what's in those articles. The preamble of the Constitution. This is probably what you've heard of. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. I love to read that out loud, even though I don't like to read slides out loud because I think it's beautiful. And I think what is brilliant about our Constitution is that at a time when most of the world was dealing with monarchies, the United States decided that it was important to move towards something that wasn't tyrannical and was different. And I think the part, obviously, that the Constitution leaves out is that it was designed for white men. It was not inclusive of all people. But when we look at the Constitution, the words in it have been leveraged by women, by communities of color throughout our history to fight for equity. And what I always say is there are 3 branches to the Constitution, but there's a 4th bonus branch. This is just Jillian gave it. This is not the law. The 4th bonus branch is the people. And I say that we're the 4th bonus branch because democracy is only as strong as we make it. All of democracy is a trust. It is a trust between us and the officials, right? The people and the officials. And so there's no like magic that's guiding America, right? We are guiding America. And so if we want democracy to be preserved, we need to keep it that way, right? We need to keep it as truth. And this is part of the reason why so much history is being censored, because if we censor history and we censor the stories of Black activists, of feminists, of LGBTQ activists who fought to make democracy more just, more tranquil, more liberty, right? More free. If we censor those stories, then people today don't have the roadmap for how to move forward. And that's what the people in power want to do, right? They want to keep these stories from us. They want to keep this history from us so that we don't stand up for our rights. And I need us to all remember that we were always the one in power. This is just an overview of the 3 branches of government and the articles that outline those branches. So the legislative branch is what makes the laws for the country. I often hear people will say to me, well, why can't the president just make that law? It's not actually the president who has the power to make laws for the United States. The president, we'll talk a little bit about some of their checks, right, has the ability to send out executive orders, but does not necessarily have the power to make laws, right? The executive branch is responsible for carrying out the laws, and the judicial branch is responsible for interpreting the laws. Okay, so some checks and balances on the executive branch. So when a law is passed, right, Joe Biden can veto laws that Congress passes, can also call special sessions of Congress, can make appointments, can negotiate foreign treaties, can issue executive orders. I think something that we need to remember that's really important about the role of the executive branch that not everyone remembers is the executive branch is the sole authority of the military. I feel a lot safer with Joe Biden as president when I felt a lot safer when Joe Biden, when Putin invaded, that Joe Biden was president. I was concerned. I was thinking about what would have happened if Trump was president with his erratic behavior and his pattern for inconsistency, what that would have meant for foreign policy in that moment. And so I think oftentimes It's important to remind people that the president is responsible for that. When I think about the threat that climate change poses, the president has the power to work with the United Nations. That is not necessarily something that Congress has the authorization to do. And then checks on the judicial branch, right? They get to appoint the justices and can grant pardons to federal offenders. So some Republicans are actually calling for Joe Biden to pardon Donald Trump. Only the president can do that on a large scale level of federal offenders, like someone like Trump. We saw that happened with Nixon, right? Nixon was pardoned after Watergate. I wanted to show you this chart because we often think about the president appointing to the Supreme Court, but it's not just the Supreme Court in terms of the 9 justices of the judicial branch, but also the justices across the country. So in many cases, right, we see that the Republicans have had a 50-year strategy really to overturn Roe. This was not something that happened overnight. And that started with appointing justices at lower levels. So if you look at this chart, I want you to kind of zoom in on the number of justices that Barack Obama got to appoint and the number of justices that Donald Trump got to appoint. Love for someone in the chat just kind of share what they're noticing about the number of justices Obama got to appoint versus the number of justices Trump got to appoint. Anyone seeing? Obama got blocked, right? So we're seeing, right, that what happened was over time, right, that, right, Obama was in office for so long, but got so few, right? The Republicans have had more, right? And so even though Obama, right, he did have more judges than Trump, right? But he was a president for 2 terms, right? And only had 100 more positions, right? This was Mitch McConnell's master strategy, right? To block all of the justices from Obama's nominees. And that's, a lasting effect that Obama had on the courts. And so when we're thinking about, this, it's not just about the Supreme Court, it's about also the smaller and the lower level courts that we're talking about. Some of the examples of the checks on the legislative branch has on the other parts of government, right? He can override the president's veto, confirm or reject executive appointments. The judicial branch, they can create federal courts, lower federal courts, they can impeach and remove judges. So if you've been following the news, Clarence Thomas, there's been recent calls for his impeachment because he was taking money from a billionaire to pay for luxury trips. And so, that is something that only Congress can do. If people want to have him removed, right, it's only Congress can remove a Supreme Court justice towards impeachment, but they can also be impeached, right? Just like the president can be impeached. Only Congress can propose amendments to overrule judicial decisions. And so when Roe was overturned, my friend asked me, how can this happen? And it's because what we're seeing right now is there's a gridlock in Congress. And so our Supreme Court is actually legislating much more than they should. Because Congress is so hyperpolarized, they should be passing more and more laws, and they're not. And so as a result, the Supreme Court is having to, like, quote, legislate from the bench as these decisions reach the highest court. And that's not what we want, because we didn't elect the people to the Supreme Court, and that's not really representative of what we need. And it is part of the Republican strategy, as you saw with Speaker McCarthy, to sow mistrust in the government and to start chaos in the government, because they do want to dismantle the federal government. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is their strategy in many ways to dismantle the work of the federal government. Okay, so one thing I want you to do, and this is from my contacts in my phone, is one of your action items is to look up who your 2 senators and congressional representatives are. And I want you to plug their contact information into your phone, both DC and the district. So if you see there, I have home, the 212 number is Jillian's New York's office. Work, I mean, I just put it in as work because it's in iPhone, but her DC office is the 202 zip code. And why I do this, I have Jillian Schumer and Daniel Goldman is my US representative. Goldman as in Goldman Sachs, so he's not really representing my middle class background. So when there's an issue, right, I have them in my phone, I call them and I make sure that they're hearing from me. And, I make sure that I have that in my phone for people to see. Are people able to see the slides? Someone was saying they weren't able to see them. Okay. So just an important way to, create a barrier, reduce the barrier of entry for making those calls. And then I also follow my representatives on Instagram and Twitter, just so I'm aware of all the things that are happening around them. So this will help you stay involved. The judicial branch, really, their major checks is that they can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. And so, what we're seeing, which I mentioned a little earlier, is, we're seeing that the Supreme Court is legislating from the bench because they're having to make too many decisions because Congress is in a gridlock. And so that is something that we need to move to vote for representatives, not only who represent our views, but are willing to compromise, right? And I think about someone like Chris Murphy, who might not be the most progressive senator, but he represents Connecticut. He, represents the district where students were killed because of, gun violence. And he worked with the Texan Republicans to come up with a bill for better gun safety. And that is the kind of people we need, who are willing to compromise, who are willing to have conversations, to make these things happen. Okay. I'm seeing a question. Who do you actually speak to? Great question. Okay. So you always speak to someone who's probably an intern. So they probably know a lot less about government than you. But what they do is they always ask you your address, right? So they know, making sure you're actually from the district. And they'll take a statement, they'll take your email. I will say that for the state, we'll talk about state representatives. For the state level, they usually do always call me back if they're not there. I've actually gotten calls back from my state senator. I've not gotten calls back from Chuck Schumer. I guess he's a little too busy for me. But you won't ever talk to Chuck Schumer or probably your senator directly in the US Senate, but in the state Senate or in the state house, I have spoken directly to my representatives. They have called me back. I've spoken directly to my city council members. So especially on the local level, those calls are really important. And then I had a friend who worked on the Hill, and the way he described it is what they do is they log the number of calls and they track which issue you're calling about. Oh, Julie just did that. Wrote exactly what we were saying in the chat. And so if there's 300 calls about gun reform that day, and there's only 100 calls about protecting gun rights, they're going to bring it to the senator and say, we've got 300 calls today about gun violence and gun reform. You need to put that out onto the table. And a lot of, the NRA has a lot of money, but one of the biggest reasons why the NRA was successful is because people call all the time, right? It's not just about money. And Mitch McConnell recently said that he needed to change the way Republicans were dealing with gun issues because they were losing elections over it. And that's because of organizations like Red, White, and Blue, because of organizations like Everytown, right? Where they're seeing there's a political block of people who are not happy about this. And so it also doesn't matter in so many ways. Like, people are worried, like, what am I going to say, right? Which law am I talking about? You just need to tell them what issue you care about and why it matters to you. Personal stories are really helpful because those are memorable. I'm seeing why are calls better than email. So the government is a bit archaic in the sense that the more old form communication it is, the more they see you caring about it. What I mean by that is you showing up on their doorstep means you care about it the most, right? You knocking on their door. I don't think people really send faxes anymore, but people say that, right? But faxes and phone calls, right? You're putting more effort than if you're just sending that form email that you get from, right, like the working family parties, and they know it's just a form email, right? So even if you take the working family parties, for example, their template or a red, white, and blue template, and you alter it a little bit and send it from your personal email, that will show them that they care, right? And it's not that those emails don't matter. You should definitely do all those things, right? I sign all the petitions. Every email that comes in from me from these organizations, I get involved and I send it. But the calls matter because they know that you're taking the time, and that shows them a higher level of interest, and they rank those higher when they bring those to their senators. Okay, so someone had asked about the amendment process, so I want to talk about that. There are Article 4 in the Constitution outlines the amendment process. There are 27 amendments in the Constitution, the first 10 of the Bill of Rights. We know the first, right, is about the right to protest, the freedom of speech, freedom of religion. A lot of conservatives will say that the founding fathers were Christian and wanted, we should go back to being a Christian nation. Not only is that unfair to everyone in this country who isn't Christian, that's also not the vision of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was one of the leaders of the Anti-Federalist Party, who wanted the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution because he didn't feel the Constitution protected the rights of the people. And he refused, with another block of people, the Anti-Federalists, to ratify the Constitution until rights for individuals were included. And he was very much in favor, Jefferson, of separating church and state. George Washington was very much in favor of separating church and state. And so if you hear that being said by conservatives, that the founding fathers wanted the Constitution to be backed into a Christian nation, I've heard Mrs. DeSantis say it. That is not historically accurate. Also, really important rights that are in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Amendments 4 through 8 are all the rights of the accused. So the rights to the fair trial, rights to a lawyer, rights to not be searched and seizured without a warrant. Amendment 9 is a really tricky one. That is called unenumerated rights, which means the founders left in the Constitution room for interpretation, which they said that not everything outlined in this document is necessarily going to cover everything that we need. And so we're leaving unenumerated rights open to the people, that some things that are not directly listed here in the Constitution can be interpreted as such. And so one of those examples is the right to privacy. So the quartering, they said you couldn't quarter troops, which is amendment number 3. Because the British were forcing soldiers into the houses of the colonists. And so that has been reinterpreted in the modern day, because no one's forcing troops to live with us, but that has been reinterpreted in the modern day as a right to privacy. And so even though the right to privacy is not directly stated in the Constitution, there are cases and precedent where that has been used to defend that. And then Amendment 10 in the Bill of Rights is to give rights back to the states. So the amendment process, right? There are 2 ways in which an amendment can be made to the Constitution. So 2/3 of both the House and the Senate need to approve an amendment. And so that's also a misconception that people have, right? Oh, the Democrats held the House and the Senate. They had the majority. Why can't we get more amendments to the Constitution? Why can't things get passed faster? Well, you need 2/3 of the House and the Senate to pass right on that. The other way, which is not really heard of because it hasn't ever been done before, is that you can call a constitutional convention if 2/3 of the state houses are represented by a certain party. This is really important. The Republican Party is on a mission to hold a second constitutional convention. They want to hold a second constitutional convention with 2 goals. Goal number 1 is to eliminate the progressive income tax, which is amendment number 16. Goal number 2 is to weaken the rights of women and marginalized groups of people. They want to weaken the amendment, the 14th Amendment. In order to do this, in order to reconvene a constitutional convention, the Republican Party needs to control 34 state houses. They currently hold 28. They're very close to this goal. And it's why your state representatives really, really matter. State houses, local representatives really matter. If we eliminated the progressive income tax, that would eliminate, in many ways, public education, welfare, social security, housing protections, right? This is also not something that they're hiding. Rick Santorum gave a statement about it recently. They've been meeting frequently about this issue. So I think it's something that is really important to understand, that this is happening, that this is in the works. And just like, I think one of the things that progressives can learn from conservatives is their masterful way of staying in the long run for an issue and making it happen. And so, for example, the movement to overturn Roe started in the 70s when Roe was, approved. And so I think that it's important for us to remember that they have long game strategies, and we have to play the long game too and be aware of this. And I think what's hard about this is that Republicans aren't always really legislating, right? So I think they're just always focused on these malicious strategies. They're not really like, solving climate change or fixing our schools or proposing anything useful. And so Democrats have to play two games, which is actually lead and then also, play the strategy. But I think it's important, to keep that in mind. And then I saw someone in the chat, right? We need the ERA more than ever, right? So the Equal Rights Amendment, Ayanna Pressley, House Representative from Massachusetts, recently just brought a proposal to reinstate the fight for the ERA, and so that has never been passed, right? So there is nothing in the Constitution that says you cannot discriminate against people on the basis of sex, which is what the ERA would do. Okay, I'm seeing someone also constitutional convention in PA, right? This is good to know, right? That there's people who are currently active and thinking about these things, and we should be aware of them. So pivotal, and many historians will call this the second founding of America, the Reconstruction Amendments. So after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution, and really changed the trajectory of the United States. So I want you to just take a second. This is the text from those amendments. I would like for you to just read that to yourselves, and then we'll talk a little bit about them. So just take a moment to read them. Okay, so something I want to point out, and if you've watched the documentary The 13th, Ava DuVernay has so brilliantly, she's the director of that documentary, pointed this out. But slavery was abolished because of the 13th Amendment, except as a punishment for a crime. That is so important because in many ways we still have slavery in the United States in our prisons. We have men and women who are incarcerated, who are working without pay, and that is a form of slavery. And I think in some ways, really, really damaging because it's unseen, right? We don't see our prisoners all the time, right? Whereas plantation slavery, urban slavery was in people's faces. And so there was a bigger abolition movement. I think sometimes the movement to end our prison system is not as strong because we can't see the pain right in front of us. And in some ways, I think that makes it really, really dangerous and doesn't protect people. What I think is also important to know is that all throughout the period of from 1877, when Reconstruction ended, up through the 1970s, there were laws in place that really targeted Black people for crimes that really didn't amount to anything. And so an example of that is in the state of Louisiana, you were not allowed to meet in a group of people if you were Black. And so you could get arrested for congregating together then you're incarcerated, and now you're a part of a convict lease system. And then if you look at the 15th Amendment, right, you can vote. But if you are accused of, right, you should be able to vote even if you were formerly incarcerated. But we see in so many places, people who are accused of crimes are not able to vote. And so, you know, we see how really damaging this was. The 14th Amendment has been the basis for basically changing the trajectory of the United States to create equality under the law, because this is the only piece of the Constitution really that names that. And so Polly Murray, who was a legal scholar in the 30s and the 40s, she used the 14th Amendment to argue for integration of schools. Ruth Bader Ginsburg studied their work in order to argue for the 14th Amendment to protect women. And so it's just a really pivotal amendment. And it's one of the reasons why in this Constitutional Convention, Republicans want to attack it. So I also want to talk a little bit about this concept of federalism. And federalism is the idea that there's powers between the federal government and the state government. Every state has their own constitution. And so the executive branch in the state government is the governor, right? There's a Congress and there's a Supreme Court, right? People were mentioning Wisconsin in the chat earlier, right? That's the state Supreme Court. There's also really other important roles. So Attorney General is the legal guardian of rights of the people of the state. Secretary of State. These roles have become increasingly important as we see issues like Trump being indicted for criminal actions, right? This is where federalism is a check on the federal government. The attorney generals in Georgia, in New York, in DC, there's also a case, right? They are charging Trump with crimes, and that is an office that is voted in. Secretary of State in many places is the place where Trump was trying to get secretaries of states to decertify the election results, right? That's what the trial is about in Georgia, because he called the Georgia Secretary of State, asked him to not certify the results. That Secretary of State said, no, I will defend the election. And so these are really important offices that are, you know, it's important for us to be aware of and know what they are. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the historical context behind federalism. So there's a sinister reason and a noble reason why federalism was included in the Constitution, why the Constitution, founding fathers decided that we should have this concept. I'd love for us to put into the chat maybe what are those reasons? Do we know what the sinister reason is, and do we know what the noble reason is? Why is there a division of powers between the state and the federal government? Slavery, Kristen, immediately. Okay, so that's the sinister reason. What's the noble reason? States' rights is coded language. I'll talk a little bit about that for slavery. Direct democracy. It's not direct democracy, but it's checks and balances, right? To prevent too much power in the government, state or federally, right? Protection against tyranny. And so I want to say that there's both those reasons, because both of those reasons are very true. And I think one thing that we're doing in America right now is we're not balancing multiple truths at once. And US history and the US government is very complicated. And the more we try to just see things from one perspective, the worse off we're going to be, right? There are multiple truths in history. And so I want to talk a little bit about slavery and the Constitution. And I think the Constitution is a wonderful and powerful document, but that is the story that most of us have heard. So I'm focusing a little bit on the negative right now, not because I think the Constitution is a completely negative document. I don't. I think it's an incredible document. But I'm telling the stories that most people don't hear. So at the Constitutional Convention, the founding men did not know what to do about the issue of slavery. What is also interesting is there were indigenous men at the Constitutional Convention from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And they said to Benjamin Franklin, where are your women? Because in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, women had political power. And Benjamin Franklin spent time living amongst the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and we borrowed many ideas about democracy from the Haudenosaunee. And so a lot of times we also think our Constitution was derived from the Greeks and the Romans, and in some ways it was, but it was also derived from our neighbors, the colonial neighbors, the people who were on this land in New York, the Seneca Nation, the Oneida Nation. These were the people who were really driving democracy. So there were a few things that people could not decide on about slavery in the Constitution. The first was many people wanted to abolish it. There were abolitionists at the Constitutional Convention, but there were many people who did not want to abolish it, who were benefiting tremendously from the institution of slavery. And so they kind of postponed the decision. They punted it down the line. And they said that the slave trade would no longer be viable after 1808. They included a law called the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that if people went to states where slavery was no longer in existence, they needed to be returned back to their owners. The Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened in the 1850s and was one of the leading causes of the Civil War. The 3/5 Compromise is a common misunderstanding about the Constitution. So people said that Black Americans were treated as 3/5 of a person. That is not what the case was. The 3/5 Compromise was to increase representation for the Southern states. So they couldn't decide if they were going to have representation based proportionally on the population or equal representation. That's how we got the House and the Senate. So the Senate is designed to respect the views of the smaller populous states, right? We have equal representation. And the House of Representatives was to reflect the views of the more populous states, where it would be based on the population. The Southern states thought, well, we can get more representatives if we count our enslaved population. And so the Northern states were like, no, we're not going to count your enslaved population because you're not going to let them vote. And so what they decided was that for every 5 people who were enslaved, 3 would count towards the number of representatives. And so what this did was it amplified the number of representatives that places like Virginia or Maryland got. And so we see how, Black Americans at this time are being used for political power and being given none. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, the only people who could vote were white male property owners. It wasn't until 1828 that non-property owners could vote. The 15th Amendment, which we just discussed, was in 1867. I put white women in 1920, and I don't put all women in 1920 because there was still Jim Crow laws going on in the South, which heavily restricted Black women from voting, even though the 19th Amendment was passed. Native Americans didn't fully gain citizenship until 1921, and so they could not vote. And then Black women and Black men did not get full enfranchisement until 1965 with the Voter Rights Act, which we saw then again was gutted in 2014. We see all these voting suppression laws come up, right? And so there's still a lot of work to do around this. And so, as you mentioned, that the Chinese Americans didn't get the right to vote officially until the 1940s, because that's when the Chinese Exclusion Act was abolished. But what was interesting about immigrants, and I see that as a great question, Curtis, what's interesting about immigrants, and you see this with Native Americans too, is the cost that they had to pay to get citizenship. And so Native Americans were forced to go to boarding schools. If you heard this horrible expression, right? Kill the Indian, save the man. This idea was that if we take the culture out of the Native Americans, we'll make them more civilized. And so most people who were immigrants had to assimilate to whiteness in many ways. And what that meant was giving up legal rights, their rights to citizenships in other countries, rights to their land, rights to their culture, in order to become citizens of the United States. Okay, and so I want to talk a little bit about the abuse of federalism, which people named right off the bat. So federalism was created in many ways to preserve the institution of slavery. So someone wrote states' rights. Since the dawn of the country, people have been talking about states' rights, right? States' rights to what? They were talking about their states' rights to own people. And that's why they wanted federalism. The state of Virginia wanted to continue to own people. And so they said we need to have power given to the state so we as a state can regulate our ability to own people and maintain the institution of slavery. As the United States changed, the way we talk about this changes, right? So this was how we see Jim Crow upheld, right? To prevent interracial marriage, to maintain school segregation, to maintain sodomy laws. Sodomy laws means you could not engage in sexual intercourse with people of the same sex as you. And sodomy laws were not repealed until 2003 across the federal government. It was used to prevent same-sex marriage, right? And we're seeing this coded language again in the present day, right? So people will say, I have a state's rights to own a gun. I have the state right to reproductive rights, right? I have state's rights to control my schools. I have parental rights. What that really means underneath it all is I want to defund the federal government so that impoverished people and people of color and women have less rights. And so when you hear states' rights and when you hear parental rights, it should set up an alarm in your head. Let me do more research into this. What are they actually trying to do? And so we see this happening, right, with federalism, that certain states are not providing money to their people to get access to social services, to get fully funded schools, right? The state of Texas is starting a voucher system to try to funnel kids to private schools and defund public education. So it's important for us to really keep this in mind about what does the abuse of federalism look like. In some ways, we see federalism as helping our country, right, as a check on power of the federal government. So as I mentioned, states are holding the president accountable, President Trump accountable for his former actions, criminal actions, for the insurrection, for using campaign money to pay off Stormy Daniels, and for trying to overturn the election in Georgia. Those are the three major indictments that he's facing. States are passing environmental regulations to help mitigate the effects of climate change. So when we think about the state of California, if it was a country in Europe, it would be the 5th largest country in Europe. And so some of the work that they're doing to mitigate climate change is really powerful and can be a blueprint for other states, right? We saw that states held up the results of the election. And we see that states are responding to conservative backlash, right? So the state of Connecticut, it is already being implemented. Everyone must teach Indigenous history and Black history as part of their courses. I just saw that Phil Murphy in New Jersey passed protections for transgender people. New York recently updated in 2019 its abortion laws to protect women. And so, we're seeing that in many cases, federalism can be helping as well. Okay, so action number 3, which is the same. I want you to look up who your governor, state representative, secretary of state, and attorney general are. This is a pretty savvy group. So you might already know who your governor is, but I just want to make sure, I don't want to be talking down to anybody, but I just also want to make sure we're checking off all our boxes and getting all those information into our phone. And I want to talk a little bit about something I hear all the time. I'm a New Yorker, and people will say to me, but I live in a progressive state, Jillian. Why do I need to call my representatives? So I want to tell you a tale of 3 representatives. So Letitia James is my representative and as Attorney General. And I saw her in 2017 and she said, no lie, every morning I wake up and every day I have to sue Donald Trump for something he's doing that's unconstitutional. Letitia James is doing her job. Letitia James is someone I feel who really, really serves me. Kathy Hochul became the governor, first woman governor in New York. Huge achievement. She became the governor when Cuomo resigned for being a sex offender, sexual assaulter. So she's, way better than that. But at the same time, she's trying to raise the charter school cap in the state because she's in bed with billionaires and they get tax breaks for opening up more charter schools. And I work for a charter school and many of our seats are not filled. We don't need more charter schools in New York City. We need our schools, we need better teachers, we need more support. Universally, people are against the charter school cap, and that's just one example of how Kathy Hochul is not really representing the entire progressiveness of the state. Joanne Simon is my state representative. when I called her office and asked for the New York State education budget to be passed, because it hadn't been passed in 10 years, fully funded, schools hadn't been fully funded in New York for 10 years. And I called her office, and her legislative director did call me back. And her legislative director said, "You're asking for us to do something that's impossible." I said, "It's impossible to pass the education budget?" She said, "It's impossible. Joanne can't do that." Well, Joanne's not serving me. All of these women are Democrats. Now, my point is, not all Democrats are the same. And not all Democrats are going to be representing what you want. Now, these are issues that are important to me. These women do other things that I think are great universally, right? And I still voted for all these women, because at the end of the day, we have to vote for who best serves us, right? Not the perfect candidate, but the best candidate. But they don't all serve me well all the time. I would say Letitia James is the only one who I feel like is doing what I want her to do all the time. And so I also call that office and donate to that office regularly and say thank you, because they're also getting, some of these representatives are getting death threats, right? And so I think it's also important to think about how to keep them going and keep them motivated. I also want to talk about local government and being involved. And so another example of being in a progressive place, right, potentially, and many of you are not in progressive places, but Eric Adams is largely a Republican. The primary in New York is a closed primary. That was where the race really happened. He only won by 8,000 votes. Eric Adams is slashing the library budget. He's slashing the school budget. He's adding more money to the police, right? He doesn't represent my interests. Shahana Hanif is my councilwoman, never felt more represented by someone. And so I help on her campaign. I go out and petition for her. I'm in touch with her constituent services director. I send testimony from teachers to their office, because she is a check to the mayor, who is not doing what I feel is the right thing by kids. I'm largely talking about school issues, because that's my number one issue. So you should be aware of who your mayor is, your city council member, your school board members, your superintendents. And then I'm also very concerned about police brutality issues. So knowing who your police commissioner is or your police chief is also really important, because in many districts, those people are elected or appointed. And so the last action item of tonight, and a lot of action items, is just like knowing who all your representatives are. And contacting their office and setting up a meeting with your constituent services representatives. For some of these smaller offices, they will meet with you, right? They will sit down and meet with you, or they will give you a phone call, right? Definitely for the state offices, definitely for the local offices. And so you should really start thinking about that. If you love your representative and you think they're doing an amazing job, volunteer for them, support them, thank them. One time I had someone say to me, "AOC is my representative and I love her. I don't need to complain about anything." And I said, "Well, AOC gets a lot of heat, so just thank her for what she's doing. Remind her that you appreciate that that's the thing that she's advocating for." And I can't stress this enough. Consider running for office or getting involved in a campaign. Campaigns are understaffed. They need a lot of volunteers, especially grassroots campaigns who are trying not to take money from billionaire donors who have special interests that don't serve us. They're getting small donations and knocking on doors and making phone calls is going to make the difference in getting them elected. And so can't stress enough, run for office or get involved. And then I'll just share these last two things for my own life. Small steps make big change. So I was involved with this organization called Amplify Her. And one of the things that happened was I got my students involved and we started to do organizing for women running for office. And something I said to the woman who started the organization, I said, my students want to do this work, but they need to work paid jobs to support their families, and no political jobs pay. And so the woman who was the founder said she started a PAC, part of Amplify Her, and she started paying interns. And so instead of my students having to take jobs that were minimum wage, they got to do political jobs. And what does that mean? If I start getting involved in local politics at 16 years old, right, then I'm going to run at 27 and I have access, right? And that's so much of the pipeline is about that access. And so it was a very small step where I named the elephant in the room, like, you need to pay kids. And that is, what made a difference. And I think the last thing that I'll say, literally small steps make big change. they put her shoes in a museum. I forget which museum now, but these are AOC's campaign shoes. And she wrote, "I knocked on doors until rainwater came through my soles. Respect the hustle. We won because we outworked the competition." And those are the pictures of her shoes all torn up because she was literally knocking on doors all the time to get elected. And so those volunteer efforts, those things really, really matter in helping people. So I really just want to thank you for sitting here and listening to me for an hour and talk about civics. I really appreciate all your work. Would love for you to support Roots to Revolution if you can. Follow us, give us a follow, join our newsletter. I do a lot of work with schools. I started doing trainings for schools, for history teachers. I also do work, I've done work with healthcare organizations, with colleges, UCLA I've worked with, doing DE&I sessions. So, I'm really happy to help you. Please, take my email, please reach out. If there's anything I can do to support you, your community, teachers in your community, I would love to be there. And thank you for everything you're doing to stay politically active, to save democracy, and to support your local communities. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you so much, Jillian. Jillian, I think we did a lot of answering questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw anything that was out. I know we're a little over, so I know people, if you have to drop, that's fine. I don't know if there was anything that was outstanding.
There was just one thing, actually. How many states ratified the ERA in 1970s? Do you know?
I don't know. I'm going to Google it right now. I think there's still more. They're still doing they're still trying to get more states to. It's an ongoing effort. I think it's 34. Yeah. How many states?
Yeah, I think we're up to 34. I feel like, and there's some controversy over whether you can still be ratifying it or not. So there's lots of issues around that. I would suggest Googling that to find out the status. I think there's a lot of complicated issues around it.
And then Julie, if folks are asking for a recording of tonight.
Yes, I will have to process it and send me an email. I'll drop it in my chat if you would like a copy. Here, I'll just put my email address. It's just julie@redwine.blue. I want to say thank you guys so much to Jillian for the presentation. I just think it was amazing information. Things we've definitely forgotten since high school. And I also just want to say, when you were putting about put your representatives' phone numbers in your phone, I was like, you go, because 100% everybody, you need to put those numbers in your phone. Then you don't have to worry about like looking them up when you get mad or you hear about legislation or something is going on. I call people in my car when I'm driving to the grocery store. And if you're at all intimidated or at all worried about like making that phone call at night. You can leave a voicemail, that's the way to do it. They're going to count that information. So, and especially at the state level, they just don't get as many phone calls as say your, congressperson. So you can definitely make a huge impact at the state level. So make those phone calls. And it's important, even if your representative maybe is on your side on something, to show support for it, because they need to be able to go and talk to the constituents and talk to the members on the other side of the aisle to say, hey, I've gotten, a lot of phone calls in support of this, not just I've gotten a lot of negative phone calls. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming. Thank you to Jillian so much. We hope to see you guys soon, and everybody have a really great night.
Thank you. And I saw in the chat, Jennifer said it hasn't been ratified. It has been ratified, but it's not published in the Constitution yet. So it still needs support for more states to get published. So thank you for that clarification, and appreciate everyone for being here.
Yeah, please go check out Roots to Revolution. And I'm sure Jillian will be back in the near future. All right. Good night, everybody.